Good evening, and welcome to The Way Out Show. I'm your host, Dane McCarthy, broadcasting to you from FEMA Region 5, deep in the bowels of the United Police State of Amnesia. Today is December 8, 2016. The President-elect Trump, already under fire, tremendous protests, rioting, different efforts by the mainstream media to shut down or censor the media outlets that support him. They're calling it fake news. A lot of self-examination by the so-called left, the Democrats. They call themselves the left. They're really not the left anymore, just like the right is really not the right. All that is way back. I mean, it's out of date. We're in the 21st century now. Left and right really has no meaning anymore. It's completely meaningless. And some people are even saying that the two parties have actually just switched. And it's, of course, never as simple as that. But to keep it very simple, this time the Republicans gathered in a lot of working class voters, and they are traditionally Democrats. And a lot of them are the same ones that voted for Barack Obama. And now they voted for Trump. They were disappointed with the job that Barack Obama did, so they decided they would try Trump. They would try the Republicans. Now, they may switch back because most people now in America are realizing that it doesn't matter which party you vote for, either major party can disappoint you. Either party can fail to get anything accomplished. Either party can lie to you, trick you, deceive you, misdirect you, and bring you to a state of mental, physical, moral, spiritual, emotional collapse almost, as well as financial collapse. And this is a situation that people in America find themselves in. There's also the reality, the very obvious reality, that Americans typically want to switch out from one party to the other after 8 years. And this is what we saw again happening. And some academic people pointed this out. This is a trend that's been going on for at least 40 years, where you just switch them back, switch them out. People, they want to change. Obama didn't give people the change they were hoping for. They were unwilling to continue on with the same policies that Barack Obama put in place and brought over from the previous George W. Bush Republican administration. Yes, Barack Obama did not make at all a clean break with the very unpopular policies, foreign policies and domestic, of George W. Bush. He carried on with many of those policies, even though he's in a different party. Is it any wonder that Americans are tired of relying on one party or the other to help them better their lives or maintain some kind of reasonable standard of living? So this is what people are having to contend with. Very high unemployment rates, although, yes, we're told that it's down to under 5%. Well, that's just a fake number. That's the number of people who are still attempting to get a job through the system. So they're recorded. But if they're not attempting to get a job through the system, or if they've given up trying to find a job, they are not in the system. And this would give a boost to the numbers that would be terrifying for most people, and it would make the reality shine through of the situation that the United States is actually in. And the situation that it's in is very similar to the situation that many other countries are in. High unemployment. a more and more difficult ability to live sustainably, to live comfortably, to buy what you want, to go where you want, to do what you want, to be a modern citizen in the high-tech world that we find ourselves in the 21st century, that should, by rights, logically, reasonably, be able to provide a level of existence that really exceeds the way people lived in the 20th century, not to mention previous centuries. But that doesn't seem really to be happening. Yes, the technology is there, and you have a cell phone. You don't have to, if you're stranded on a dark road late at night, leave your car and then find a farmhouse with the lights still on, and then knock on the door and ask to use the telephone. That is the way life used to be. And that could be kind of scary, but also you would also connect with people in a desperate situation, and they would help you usually. Unless you don't carry a cell phone with you or iPhone, you wouldn't have to do that, because you could call a tow truck right from your car without ever leaving your car, or get someone to come fix it, or someone to pick you up, whatever, to take you home and then deal with it the next day. So that's gone. But we really do need to deal with a lot of important propaganda efforts that are coming along to discredit the presidency of Donald Trump, to discredit the media, the alternative media. I refuse to call it the alt-right media, because I don't think it's left-wing or right-wing. We've got to get away from those terms. How about the right media and the wrong media, or the lying media and the truthful media? And some may be a mixture of both. A lot of them are, but the number of lies, the number of mistruths and untruths and misdirection, deception that we're seeing in a lot of these major media outlets is absolutely appalling. Once you understand what's really going on, once you have the information, you see the video, you read the transcript, you listen to the interview with the actual person involved, and then the spin is just that. You see it as a lie. It is spin. It isn't what really happened at all. We see this over and over and over during the election, and it's happening now. That is why so many major media outlets got completely turned around in their predictions about who would win the election. This is the same thing that happened in England with the Brexit vote. Same thing that's happening in a lot of other places around the world. It's a worldwide effort. It's a worldwide sea change. People are tired of the collaboration of government and multinational corporations essentially robbing them. So I have a couple of videos to show you today. The first one I'd like to show you is an example of what they're calling a debunker of fake news. And this is one of the biggest fake news stories, is the climate change fake news story that has been going on since the 80s. Remember, the 80s. James Hansen, who was a scientist and an activist working for NASA, came up with this idea that CO2 in the atmosphere caused global warming. So James Hansen is known as the father of global warming. Forget climate change. Climate change is not the same as global warming. But nevertheless, that connection is made in your mind. If there was no global warming, there would be no climate change. So even though they're two separate things, you are are required in your brain to put global warming and climate change together as one manifestation of a phenomenon. Even though they're two separate things, you have to mentally put them together, but without using the word global warming, because global warming has been debunked so many times by reputable scientists over and over and over that it now becomes virtually impossible even to use the term global warming. So they switch to climate change because what does climate change mean? It's meaningless. It could be anything, almost. And so that is part of the deception. So let's look at this interview that Millie Weaver of InfoWars does with this gentleman who makes a very interesting case and some very interesting points about climate change. So let's roll this short clip.
Millie Weaver reporting for Infowars.com. I'm here in Phoenix, Arizona, where just this last weekend, the Freedom Force International Group held a conference here on the subject matter of climate change and the inconvenient lie that's being perpetuated by the mainstream media and other people, such as Al Gore, that man is responsible for climate change and that we need to all hurry up and take action in this. Well, Donald Trump just met with Al Gore, and we have all these mainstream media leftist outlets touting that Donald Trump is going to veer from his campaign pledges and keep some of these regulations on the basis of man-made climate change.
The bulk of the time was with President-elect Donald Trump. I found it an extremely interesting conversation and to be continued. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, I have information that counters that. I just met with a man this weekend named Timothy Ball that spoke at this conference, who is scheduled to meet with Donald Trump's EPA pick. This is very important because this man has evidence that counters the beliefs and opinions of Al Gore. So let's go ahead and hear what he has to say. You're scheduled to meet with Trump's advisor soon, isn't that correct?
Yeah, well, one of the things that about 25 years ago, I appeared before Congress on the climate issue, and I was also invited to speak at a place called the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I met a Myron Ebell, and then at the Heartland or climate conferences around, I met him several times. It's about a month before the election date, he was notified by the Trump people that he was going to be put in charge of deregulating EPA. So was invited to go and meet with Myron in Washington on the 12th of December, and we'll lay out the issues. He knows a lot of it, but one of the things I think I can contribute is providing him with ways of explaining to the politicians and to the public the complexities. When you burn ethanol, which of course is plant produced, and the government was telling people, oh, that when you burn ethanol, there's less CO2 produced than from fossil fuels. It's not true. It's simply not true. When you burn ethanol, you get far more CO2 produced, okay? But what they did was they said, oh, well, growing the plants takes CO2 out of the atmosphere, so we're giving them a net figure. But with the actual car going down the road, the ethanol car is putting out far more CO2 than the fossil fuel car. And of course, the government shifted the subsidies to corn producers, that they got far more money if they produced the corn and it went to the ethanol plant than if it went to the food plant. That led to a massive increase in basic food costs around the world. And I'll show you how that links. When corn is basic and the price went up, all of the other basic food supplies went up. That led to food riots in Egypt. Okay, Obama said, oh no, that's Arab Spring, that's democracy. No, it wasn't. There was the food riots.
Wow.
But Obama, of course, said, oh, well, we've got to get rid of Hosni Mubarak because he wanted to put the Muslim Brotherhood in. So he exploited a situation that his own policies in the corn market had created. But this is the kinds of clever and devious games that they use.
What are some of the health or environmental effects that these supposed green energy projects can do?
Well, the alternate energies, of course, are in terms of the bird kills, the bat kills, the environmental damage, the noise that they produce, the footprint. In order to replace a 1,000 megawatt coal station, you need acres and acres of land, because the turbines have got to be spread out because they interfere with each other. If you go by a wind turbine field, there's always one turbine turning. That's being driven by electricity off the grid, because you need that energy to get the other wind turbines started, okay? Plus, once you're using wind power as a source of energy into the grid, you can only use about 12% of your total energy production from wind or solar, because if it disappears, the system will draw on the grid, and so the grid has to be able to pick up that power demand instantly. So what people don't know is when the wind turbines are turning, the coal plant is also running. So again, this goes back to this problem of doing proper cost-benefit analysis, and that is just missing in every phase of this whole environmental scam. And that needs to be looked at. And particularly if it's a project like a wind project, the government don't want to hear about the problems with it. They suppress all of that. But there are so many side effects. One of the things that's concerned me for a long time is noise pollution in our atmosphere. Like I have artificial ears because flying without proper hearing protection. But the noise issue and its ability to excite the cells and trigger all sorts of reactions, it's obvious that there's a problem. The biggest climate events that affect humans and animals are floods and droughts, and droughts in particular. And in the U.S. here, virtually no research done on that, and yet those are huge issues. And water resources, the quality of water. I mean, you saw the Flint, Michigan situation. That's criminal in today's world. But the water issue, it to me is another one that simply has not received attention because of the focus on the global warming issue.
Are you going to advise for him to kind of defund some of these different green energy projects?
You withdraw the funding, the whole thing dies. If there was anything in it, and there was some money to be made in it, then private industry would step in and fill that need right away. But the fact they haven't proves that there is nothing. Trump is not going to ignore regulations. I mean, he's actually said it. He said, we can't get rid of the EPA completely. We do need to look after our planet. We do need to deal with pollution and so on. But there are so many other issues that are complete non-issues that if we took that money and spend it where it's needed, we could be far more effective. And of course, that's the whole idea about a business person is, how do I spend my dollars most effectively? And so that's what I'm hoping to be able to do, is say, look, you don't need to spend money here. CO2 is not a problem. And therefore, the money you're spending there, which is about $70 billion a year, can go to some other, for example, clean water supply in every city in America, in every community in America. And this is the problem, that real issues have been pushed aside by these phony issues. I mean, they talk about fake news. This is fake science, but for a political agenda.
The concerns that these media outlets are perpetuating that Donald is going to veer from his campaign pledges are simply inaccurate, and it's just to try and make Donald look bad in any way possible. Just more fake news from the mainstream media. This is Millie Weaver signing off for Infowars.com.
Yeah, so that is the clip with the gentleman whose name I can't remember, but he has some very interesting things to say, seems quite knowledgeable, and I would recommend anyone who doubts what he says to review the clip and just sort of check it out. look at what he says about the complexity that is involved in trying to decipher how much CO2 is being released into the environment from doing various human activities. And you know, this subject is much bigger, of course, than what this gentleman is saying. It is, what I would do is check out a site called Climate Depot. And what it is, it collects lots of information, various studies, interviews, articles from all different sources. It doesn't generate its own news. It is a collection site from a lot of other people, from a lot of other scientific journals. I saw an article in Climate Depot from the Wall Street Journal, which is an op-ed piece written by a scientist who was a climate skeptic. He questioned whether humans were really responsible for climate change. And he made some interesting points in that. I would urge anyone to look at that article from the Wall Street Journal. What I really like about all this is because if you don't see the details, if you don't understand who James Hansen is, who the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what that is, that's the IPCC. If you've never heard of the IPCC, if you've never heard of Michael Mann, then you are not going to understand. Al Gore is just a front man. James Hansen advises Al Gore. Now, Al Gore made a statement, and he was following the lead of James Hansen. James Hansen in 2006 said that by 2016, 10 years from 2006, that would be this year, there would be catastrophic Arctic ice melt. It would be the full brunt of global warming would have hit us. And what we're seeing is we're not seeing the full brunt of climate change hitting us. In fact, we're not seeing any particular effects whatsoever. We're not seeing the ocean level rise. If that were the case, Manhattan would be flooded, Miami would be flooded, many other places would be flooded, permanently flooded because of sea level change. That's what happens in sea level change, is around the world, areas of land that are at sea level would be flooded. We are not seeing that. We are not seeing the ice caps melt. They keep saying that they're melting, but then nothing ever happens. You know, Greenland, the ice caps are still on Greenland. They're not gone. They're not. There are places where there's been warming, but not to a significant degree that would make for a worldwide or even a local catastrophe. The floods that we're seeing, the droughts that we're seeing, have always happened. The tornadoes, the hurricanes, the typhoons are not particularly catastrophic. They're no worse than they used to be. In fact, they're not as powerful as they used to be. And this, you can check this. This is worldwide. Some scientists say that global warming causes an increased level of hurricanes, cyclones, and things like this, tornadoes. Others actually say that global warming actually reduces the severity of these weather events. So are we having global warming, or are we having global cooling, or are we having the same? Well, we're actually having all of those things. We're having all three. They're all happening. In the winter, we're having global cooling in the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, they have a winter too. They're having cooling. Some places are staying relatively the same. Some places are having floods, like they always have, or different places are having floods that haven't had floods, or some places are too dry. Now, there is a component of weather manipulation that's also involved, and this is rarely talked about when climate change activists are involved. They don't seem to care about manipulation of the weather by human activity deliberately. That is human activity causing climate change, at least locally, and maybe even possibly globally, because of the efforts to geoengineer the planet. At least that's what they call it. They call it geoengineering. But in a way, it's for one thing, used for military purposes, and so the weather's been manipulated at least since the Vietnam War to create rain, to create droughts, and in different places around the world. And that technology is advancing very quickly. And the chemtrails, my friends, are real. They're not a figment of anyone's imagination, because one merely has to look up on a day that the chemtrails are in the sky and see them, a crossword puzzle, a checkerboard pattern, or all kinds of different patterns, random. You see planes turning, maybe two planes even turning, and they're leaving trails that hang there for hours, and they spread. Like a trail will go across the sky, and it just hangs there. And then, as the wind catches it, it starts to feather out on one side. And then it just continues to feather out, and and then more planes come by, and they leave trails. And before you know it, after a few hours, the whole sky is covered with a veil, a gray veil, so you could barely see the blue sky through it. And these are not natural. I've been on this planet for 67 years, and I didn't see this happening until the late 90s. I refused to even believe it myself at first, but then when you realize that, if you look at the old movies, old movies from the 40s, from the 50s, even from the 60s and 70s and 80s, you don't see that. You don't see it. You don't see these trails just hanging in the sky, because a lot of, particularly Westerns, where you see a lot of the big sky country out west, California, a lot of Westerns in the 40s, 50s, even before and after, were shot in California and in that general area. And you just don't see that. You just don't see that in the big sky, blue sky, Technicolor Westerns, or even in the black and white Westerns. I've seen a lot of Westerns. I'm an old guy, I like Westerns. But where are they? And people have told me, well, they're just, they were there, but nobody noticed or something. Or there's more air traffic. Well, yeah, on days that you see a lot of this aerial spraying, the aerosol spraying that hangs in the sky, yeah, you do see a lot of jets. And on the days that you don't see it, you don't see a lot of jets. Yes, so that's right, exactly. But they're not commercial jets, they're military jets. And this has been proven over and over and over, that these things really are putting toxic chemicals, particles in the sky, into the stratosphere, and eventually they're filtering down on all of us. They're raining down on the entire world. And they're causing problems, health problems, from many, many, many people. Look it up. Check it out yourself. So is that fake news? You know, I'm sure that the government would love to say that chemtrails are fake news, even though people can look up and see it for themselves. And they would say, well, what you're seeing, that isn't anything unusual. Those have always been there. Ever since the invention of jets, they've been there. Oh, really? And where are they? Let's see the evidence. But no, they don't care about evidence. If you say anything that disagrees with their view, then you're a purveyor of fake news. You're a purveyor of falsity, and you need to be corrected. You need to be expunged. You need to be erased. And your voice can no longer be heard in the new 21st century world. Well, that is not going to happen. There's no possible way that the government will be able to shut down media outlets. They're trying to do it in China, but they can't do it elsewhere in the world. So I have another clip to show you that is about fake news. It's Mark Dice, and I thought it was pretty good. He's a very entertaining journalist, and he's been labeled as a fake news guy. And here's his response. So let's roll a clip.
The New York Times has just called me a fake news, hyper-partisan conspiracy theorist. This from a self-proclaimed news outlet which lost $14 million during the first quarter of 2016. This from a self-proclaimed news outlet whose publisher said that they promised to rededicate themselves to reporting honestly after the election fiasco, where every liberal media outlet got just about everything wrong. Here's the article. In the news, what's fake and what's real can depend on what you want to believe. One morning last week, Larry Laughlin, a retired business owner, opened his shiny black Dell laptop and scrolled through Facebook. Most of the posts were ordinary news stories from conservative sites. Donald J. Trump's deal with the carrier company, the political tussle over the recount, but a few items were his, quote, guilty pleasures. I like this guy, Mr. McLaughlin says, looking at a post by conservative commentator and author Mark Dice. I appreciate that, Larry. Then the Times goes on to say, Mr. Dice has promoted conspiracy theories that the Jade Helm military training exercises last year were preparation for martial law. I'm sorry, that's not a conspiracy theory. The military routinely trains for a possible disaster preparedness response, not exactly a conspiracy theory, which is why you self-proclaimed newspapers in the mainstream media are failing. Dice also says that the September 11th attacks were a, quote, inside job. I'm sorry, New York Slime, I thought it was common knowledge these days that there was a major cover-up regarding what happened on September 11th, which is exactly why the classified pages about the ties to Saudi Arabia were buried and only recently came to light. Something that, quote, conspiracy theorists suspected would prove ties between the hijackers and the Saudi Arabian government, something that the declassified pages actually confirm. But Mr. Laughlin likes him for what he says was his humorous political commentary and his sarcastic man-on-the-street interviews. I appreciate the compliment, Larry. Then the alleged journalist, the self-proclaimed journalist who wrote this piece of trash, says the proliferation of fake and hyper-partisan news that has flooded into Americans' laptops and living rooms has prompted a national soul-searching. No, it prompted the publisher of your newspaper, again, to rededicate the paper to reporting honestly, which you're still not doing. Here's the article. Can the media recover from this election? See, they know that nobody trusts them because you are trash. The larger problem, experts say. Which experts? Who is saying this? More fake news! Fake news and the proliferation of raw opinion that passes for news is creating confusion, punching holes in what is true, causing a kind of funhouse effect that leaves the reader doubting everything, including real news. Oh no! I wasn't joking when I said that the New York Times lost $14 million during the first quarter of 2016. Here's the article from the New York Times' own website. The New York Times Company reported a $14 million net loss for the first quarter of 2016 as it continues to grapple with how to offset falling revenue in print advertising. Let's do the math here. $14 million divided by 3 months, that's a quarter. That's $4.6 million a month divided by 30 days. That's $150,000 a day that they are losing. Let's divided by 24 hours in a day. That's $6,000, almost $6,500 an hour. Not even just during business hours. Every single hour that they're losing money. Let's go one step further. Divided by 60 minutes in an hour, that's $100 a minute. $100 every single minute they're losing money. You know, I had a loss yesterday. I spilled water on my keyboard. It cost me $50. So I experienced a $50 loss yesterday, but that certainly is nothing compared to the almost $2 every second that the New York Times is pissing away money. Just to show you how nobody cares about the mainstream media anymore, here is the tweet from the author of the article on her Twitter account. It has 3 likes. Here's a fellow New York Times author who tweeted it out as well, and he also got 3 likes. Literally 3 people care about what the hell this guy is even posting. The mainstream media has been attacking me pretty viciously recently, and I had to threaten to sue the London Guardian for defamation, and then they removed me from this despicable and defamatory article where they tried to tie me into David Duke and the KKK. Former Ku Klux Klan leader and the U.S. alt-right hail election results. And they included me in this, claiming that I was alt-right, even though there's zero substantiation for that. And now they did remove me from the article and put this little disclaimer in the bottom. This article was amended to remove a quoted individual who was mistakenly included. Yeah, because they didn't want to get sued for libel. This election could very well be the death nail in the mainstream media, who are now scrambling to try to regain the credibility that they have lost with their hyper-partisan and fake news articles during this entire election season. But calling people like me fake news is only backfiring. Here's an article from Slate. Stop calling everything fake news. Journalists are blurring several problems into one, making it impossible to solve. At least the New York Post is honest enough to report that the war on fake news is all about censoring real news. Look at this pathetic article from Raw Story calling me a white conspiracy theorist who uses the internet to, quote, try to, quote, debunk police shooting videos. No, I'm sorry, I am just correcting the lies from the real fake media about the armed thugs that unfortunately have to get put down by police, which then the mainstream media spins as a poor innocent black man who was gunned down by these racist white supremacist police officers. Character demolition goes hand in hand with this new video analysis. Conspiracy theorist Mark Dice appears close to the top of Google searches for Keith Scott. Presented as a media analyst, he denounced the, quote, black thugs who are rioting over this black thug. That's because Keith Scott had a gun that he threatened to kill his wife and children with recently, a gun that he refused to drop when he was confronted by police, and instead got out of his car and had it in his hand, which led the police to no other decision but to neutralize him. Unlike the mainstream media, nobody tells me what I can and cannot say, which is why this YouTube channel is growing at such a tremendous rate. I thank everybody for watching.
Well, that was Mark Dice, and he is pretty well known on the internet, very popular, very funny, does a lot of funny interviews on the boardwalk in California, right on the ocean, and he's entertaining. Let's put it that way. But he also does make some interesting points. But you can understand that he does get upset when he's labeled this way. But he doesn't really have to conform. He can be entertaining and be appalling and be shocking if he wants to be. We don't live in the Soviet Union. We don't live in communist China or any of the other dictatorships that are around the world that are so harsh and difficult, make life difficult, and don't have that wonderful bulwark against tyranny, which we call the First Amendment, which allows people to have freedom of speech. That's one of the reasons why so many people like America so much, and they want to come to America from various countries around the world, in Africa, and Central America, and South America, and Asia, and even in Europe, in certain places, in Eastern Europe particularly, they have absolutely horrific tyrannies that people who don't understand, who don't have the protections of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, have to live under and somehow survive under. Now, it's true that some parts of the world, the people simply cannot handle, apparently, the democratic system, the compromises that you have to make under democracy, and they're just apparently not ready for it. They're not educated enough about exactly what it means. And so those people get very demanding, and they're willing to fight and kill and assassinate and have civil wars on and on and on, and do terrorist attacks to get what they want. And so the only form of government that they trust, that they seem to like, is a very, very strong leader, kind of a dictatorial figure, who puts anybody who are troublemakers in jail or kills them, apparently. And this is a horrible situation to be in. And God forbid that should ever happen in the United States. And this is one of the reasons why people were so fearful of Hillary Clinton. They were afraid that she was going to institute and strengthen the powers that George W. Bush and then later Barack Obama accrued to themselves, to the office of the presidency. And they were afraid she was going to take full advantage of those powers. And what was appealing, one of the major points and aspects of Donald J. Trump was that he had a lot of money already and a lot of business interests and had a lot of things going for him. He had no need to become a billionaire because he already was a billionaire. And I really think that a lot of people, a lot of these people in power, that's what they want. That's their goal. It's not enough that they're a millionaire, that they have a few $1 million, or even 10 million or 20 or 50 or 100 million. They want to become a billionaire, and they will not be satisfied until they achieve that goal. And I think that the Clintons were in that category, very ambitious, and understanding that about the only way that a person can achieve that in a very short period of time, within a matter of a few years, is to cut corners and avoid laws and use your power to amass an enormous fortune, and essentially illegally. Famously, the Kennedy family became very wealthy through illegal means. Famously, the Bush family became extremely wealthy through essentially illegal means. And I don't mean necessarily going out with a machine gun and mowing down your enemies and running booze like Al Capone or something, becoming a mobster, but maybe you have other guys who do that kind of thing for you, and you are separated from them. You're high enough up the chain of command where none of that stuff, that rough stuff, that violent stuff, affects you personally. But when you see a person like George W. Bush getting into the office of the presidency, and I can assure you, my fear and my grief was absolutely at the top level when George W. Bush was elected, because this man was absolutely terrifying, because the level of the duplicity that he was using and the falsity, and just listening to him talk made me sick to my stomach. He really was egregious to the nth degree. And he never, I don't believe he ever truly was elected to be president at all. He used foul means to get there in the first place. And then it wasn't long before all my fears were realized, and even more than I had expected. I mean, I didn't expect there to be a 9/11 event, which was used as a trigger mechanism like Pearl Harbor to institute never-ending war, low-level war, but that has nevertheless killed hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq and around the world so far. That's being continued by Barack Obama. I'm specifically talking about the drone program, where civilians are targeted in double tap or straight up murder of civilians. Because that's what these people are. They're civilians. You're not targeting members of an army that wear a uniform, that have all the badges, that are labeling themselves as enemy combatants, as part of an organized force. Those days are probably gone forever. So instead you have the continuation of the expansion of the war machine on a global basis, the expenditure of untold amounts of ordnance that are polluting the world with depleted uranium at an alarming rate, absolutely terrifying. And what's to be done? You know, the only possible way that this information can get out to people is through the media. And if the mainstream media fails in its job, if it fails to accomplish its mission, which is to get to the truth, to find the truth, to get the truth out, to communicate it to the public, then it is no wonder that people are looking elsewhere for their news, for their information, news and information. And so you have this effort by thousands and thousands and maybe even millions of citizen journalists around the world who are not considered to be legitimate. But hey, who is legitimate? Those people are legitimate who prove themselves to be legitimate. And the mainstream media have neglected to prove themselves to be legitimate. And they have proved themselves to be illegitimate over and over and over. And I can remember this stretching back to almost to my childhood, being lied to by the media. How long is an American citizen supposed to take this lie? And I'm talking about being lied to on the news about the Vietnam War, specifically, just that particular instance. And we had both Democratic and Republican administrations in power throughout the Vietnam War. Both sides were equally liable. They were both war criminals. They were targeting civilians as a matter of course. The most egregious war crimes in the Vietnam War, most people don't even know about. Even to this day, they don't know about it. How there were over and over and over reports of chemical weapons being used against civilians, and many American soldiers themselves were sickened, and some even died as a result of inhaling or getting on their skin the various chemical weapons. And Agent Orange was just one of them. And they say, oh, Agent Orange, that was a defoliant. Well, it was very harmful to humans as well as to vegetation. It could kill you. It could destroy you. See the film Hearts and Minds. That's a documentary from the period, very enlightening. But that only scratches the surface. There's so much more that is out there that is eyewitness accounts, veterans, of what they saw, what they did, what they experienced. And there's a book out called Shoot or Kill Everything That Moves. And that is taken from first-person accounts, records that are in the National Archives. This is not made up, friends. But this would be a typical order that would be given by an officer to his soldiers: kill everything that moves. And I showed this clip on one of my previous shows about this young man, wrote the book, did the research, never lived through the Vietnam War. But this information did not get to the American people. How much sooner would the Vietnam War have ended if the American people had known the truth about what was going on? We'll never know. But 58,000 Americans died. Untold thousands were wounded mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally. Millions more Vietnamese people wounded, sickened, debilitated in one sense, their lives turned upside down, and their land polluted permanently. Even to this very day in Vietnam, you have people who are suffering from the effects of these chemical weapons. Children who are born with horrifying defects, birth defects, debilitating. So they're still paying the price for what they call the American War. And, you know, how did it all turn out? The government claimed to be so afraid of communism. Well, we work with communists now. The Vietnamese government is still communist. China is still communist. Cuba was communist, maybe it still is to a certain extent. And yet, there is so much almost affection for Fidel Castro's life, his death. He's given honors by the UN at the hearing of the occurrence of his recent death. And it goes on and on and on. So were we being lied to about the dangers of communism? Yes. Yes, we were. Was it in itself often bad for its people? Yes, it was. For some people it was good, for other people it was not so good. Some people might say the exact same thing about socialism or capitalism, that for some people it's good, for some people it's not so good. Now it's true that communism has killed a tremendous number of people in China, in the Soviet Union, and in other places where it's been instituted. Human rights violations have reached epidemic proportions, but also in fascist countries. Chile under Pinochet, for instance, just as one example. So any form of government can be abused by its leadership when that leadership is corrupt. This is what the American people have to guard against, that kind of corruption coming to the United States. And then you have this overlay of very wealthy men who are not only just billionaires, but some of them trillionaires, who have all this money, all this power, and are probably wondering, well, what can I do? Well, I need to secure my legacy. I need to extend my reach, my opinions, my belief system throughout the world. I have the power to do that. And they get together and they say, what would be best for us? What would be best for the planet? What would be best for the human race? What would be best for the environment? And they say, and since they think, well, we're superior beings, look at what we've accomplished. We're trillionaires. We're multi-billionaires. We know what's best for these childlike, ignorant cattle, these people who don't know what's going on, and they're like children. And they need a firm hand. And for one thing, there's too many of them. They're just clogging the roads. They're breeding like rabbits around the world. We need to do something about that. How will we get rid of them? To leave more room for us, the people who truly deserve to be alive. And we've proven that we're superior beings. And they believe in eugenics. Anyway, that is an offshoot. Eugenics is an offshoot of Darwinism. Charles Darwin wrote in the 1860s a book that absolutely transformed the way people thought about life on planet Earth, that maybe God was not the creator, but evolution created species and changed species and developed species over time, over a long period of time. And wealthy people thought, well, if evolution is the way that the world works, why not help it along and only promote those elements of the human race who are worthy of being promoted and worthy of propagating and creating new generations? That only makes sense. That's scientific. And naturally, they would say, well, they have to decide, well, who is superior and who is inferior? And being essentially racists, they think of themselves as being superior. And yes, therefore they go after the Native Americans, the Aborigines, the various ethnic groups, any ethnic group that is undereducated. Even the Irish were targeted as an inferior race. So this could happen to almost anyone who finds themselves in a vulnerable position. A lot of this genetics work is actually a way of disenfranchising people. It's only an excuse. Taking away their money, taking away their land, whatever it is that they have, it's a way of robbing them. So you have a few people at the very top who have been in power for decades or even centuries, who are very good at remaining at the very top. They know how to do it. They're experts at it. They pass it on to the next generation, the next generation, the next generation, and each generation adds to the wealth. But until Americans and people around the world understand that these people are truly the ones who are causing the difficulties for most of the ordinary people, then these people will continue to operate with impunity. They will run their eugenics experiments. They will initiate wars. They will destabilize countries. They will recommend to the elected leadership and the appointed leadership of various countries regime change. That's an American foreign policy, regime change, initiated by George W. Bush in a big way, causing untold human suffering around the world. And this has to stop. It doesn't need to be that way. People can live together in peace and harmony, but there are people at the top who don't want that. They're too greedy. They're too selfish. They believe that they are the superior beings. So that's all there is for today. Have a great weekend and sleep well.